On the morning of June 15, 1944, inside a dim underground bunker beneath Tokyo's Imperial General Staff headquarters, a young radar operator stared at his screen in disbelief. A faint blip, too fast, too high, too large, appeared on the scope. At first, he assumed it was a malfunction. Japan's early warning system had been plagued with interference for months, and faulty equipment was nothing new. But within seconds, more blips appeared, forming a formation unlike anything Japan had seen before. He swallowed hard and whispered, "Koriwa, Nanda. What is that?" That question would soon echo across the Japanese chain of command. The operator alerted his superior, who burst into the command room clutching a clipboard. When he saw the radar picture, objects approaching at altitudes beyond 30,000 feet, his face paled. No Japanese aircraft could reach that height. No American plane had ever flown this fast or this far toward the Islands. Within minutes, the alarm sirens inside the bunker began screaming. Across Tokyo, the once confident Imperial staff suddenly found itself confronting a new, terrifying reality. America had unveiled a weapon capable of striking the Japanese homeland in ways no one had imagined. For years, Japan had studied American bombers. The B-17 and B-24 were powerful, but they had limitations. Their range could be predicted. Their altitude was manageable. Their payloads were known. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses had been built around these assumptions. Everything, gun placements, radar networks, fighter strategies, was designed to counter these older aircraft. But the blips on the radar that morning were not B-17S, they were not B-24S. They were B-29 machines that represented the most expensive weapons program of World War II, costing more than the Manhattan Project itself. The first reports arriving at Imperial General Staff described an aircraft that flew too high for fighters to intercept, too fast for conventional tracking, and too large to be destroyed easily. Officers reviewing the early radar data realized something horrifying. The B-29 could cross thousands of kilometers of ocean and still reach Japan with a full bomb. One general leaned over the table and whispered to another, "If America deploys these in numbers, Japan is finished." It was a sentence no one dared to speak aloud in the Emperor's presence. That same day, civilians in Tokyo felt the distant rumble of engines, unlike any they had heard during the war. The sound was deeper, heavier, almost like thunder rolling across the sky. People rushed outside, shielding their eyes as they stared upward into the hazy summer clouds. For a brief moment, the B-29s appeared like silver ghosts, gliding at unimaginable altitude. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled immediately, but the climb was impossible. The Zira, Japan's most iconic fighter, was deadly in low-altitude dogfights, but it was completely outmatched. At 30,000 feet, engines sputtered, wings shook. Many pilots had to turn back before even reaching the bomber stream. For the first time in the entire Pacific War, Japan faced an American aircraft it could not fight. Inside the Naval Air Command, engineers studied the Superfortress silhouette with trembling hands. Its wingspan dwarfed anything Japan had ever built. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate at altitudes that would kill a human being within minutes. Its remote-controlled gun turrets meant it could defend itself from every angle. One admiral, known for his composure, slammed a folder on the table and shouted, "We cannot stop this machine." Silence filled the room. Japan was no longer facing an opponent across distant islands or naval battlefields. The war had come home, carried by the massive engines of the B-29. The radar operator who first spotted the approaching formation did not know it then, but he had witnessed the beginning of the end. The Superfortress was more than a bomber. It was a psychological weapon, an airborne message that America would now strike at the heart of the empire, and Japan had no answer for it. Inside the Imperial General Staff headquarters, located beneath layers of reinforced concrete in central Tokyo, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to suffocating. Officers in crisp uniforms gathered around a long, polished table, maps of the Pacific strewn everywhere, markers showing the shrinking perimeter of Japan's defensive lines. But none of that mattered anymore, not when the latest reports, stamped Goki top secret, landed in the hands of Japan's highest-ranking commanders. The B-29 had arrived, and it had exposed the Empire's greatest weakness. General Yoshihiro Umesu, Chief of the Army General Staff, read the initial intelligence documents with a slow, deliberate breath. Every line he scanned made the room feel smaller. America's new bomber could fly at nearly 32,000 feet, higher than any Japanese aircraft could reliably operate. It could carry more than 20,000 pounds of bombs twice the payload of any Japanese bomber. Its defensive systems were unprecedented. 5 remotely operated gun turrets controlled by analog computers. The Japanese officers had always believed their pilots were the best, their spirit unbreakable, but spirit could not reach the stratosphere. One colonel finally broke the silence. "Gentlemen, if even half of this is true, our entire homeland defense strategy is obsolete." Another officer snapped. "Impossible. No nation could produce such aircraft in numbers." A naval analyst corrected him, voice trembling. "America could. America is." Charts projected onto the wall showed U.S. industrial output dwarfing Japan's by a ratio so large it felt unreal. America could build hundreds of these flying fortresses every month. Japan, under constant resource shortages and relying on outdated factories, could barely assemble fighters fast enough to replace losses. Even worse. The arrival of the B-29 meant something devastating. The Americans no longer needed to capture islands just to get within range of Japan. The Marianas, Saipan, and Tinian had recently fallen, giving the U.S. runways large enough to host the massive bombers. Japan was now naked, as panic spread through the command. Field reports from the first B-29 encounters painted an even grimmer picture. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly. Shells exploded far below the American planes. Searchlights swept across the night sky, but the Superfortress flew above their reach. Even when Japanese fighters managed to take off, they arrived exhausted from the climb and unable to maneuver. One stunned pilot described the experience. It was like trying to attack a mountain that moved faster than the wind. Officers scribbled calculations in notebooks, ranges, climb rates, interception angles, all ending with the same haunting conclusion: there was no defense. Inside the Naval Aviation Bureau, Commander Minoru Genda studied diagrams of the B-29's turbo-supercharged engines, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "This technology, we cannot replicate it. Not in months, not in years." Admiral Toyota asked him bluntly, "Can we shoot them down?" Genda hesitated, then bowed his head. "No, sir." The admission struck the room like a physical blow. Meanwhile, deep within the Emperor's palace, senior advisors drafted carefully worded reports for Hero. They avoided direct statements, but could not hide the truth. Japan had entered a new phase of the war, one in which survival itself was in question. One advisor wrote, "If these aircraft attack in large formations, our cities will not endure." And he was right. For Japan's leaders, the realization was shattering. Their air defenses were outdated. Their fighters were inadequate. Their industry was exhausted. And the Americans had just deployed a weapon designed to break nations. For the first time, private conversations among generals turned somber. They whispered about outcomes they once swore would never happen. Surrender was still unthinkable, but now, defeat was no longer unimaginable. The B-29 had done far more than entered Japanese airspace. It had entered their minds, and fear had taken root. Long before the first B-29 dropped a bomb on Japan, its very existence had already crushed Japanese engineers. In factories across the home islands, dim, cold workshops where metal was hammered by hand and shortages were a daily reality. Engineers stared at blueprints, calculations, and intercepted intelligence on America's newest bomber. Many simply could not believe what they were reading. To understand Japan's reaction, one must understand the gap between the two nations' industrial capabilities. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a marvel of engineering, a machine far ahead of its time. It required technology Japan didn't have, resources Japan couldn't access, and manufacturing precision Japan could never achieve under wartime conditions. Inside, . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 Inside the Nakajima Aircraft Company, senior engineer Tsukiya Akira held a technical brief describing the B-29's Rider 3350 engines. His hands shook. These engines used turbo superchargers, capable of maintaining power at extreme altitudes, a feature Japan had attempted to develop, but failed at repeatedly. Their metallurgy couldn't withstand the temperatures. Their production lines lacked the machining accuracy needed. Their factories were frequently bombed, understaffed, and short on materials. A younger engineer asked quietly, "Could we copy it, even in limited numbers?" Tsukiya exhaled deeply. No, not even one. Japan's aircraft industry had always relied on simplicity, lightweight structures, and maneuverability, qualities that defined the Zero fighter. But the war had changed. America wasn't building elegant fighters anymore. It was building flying fortresses, technological giants requiring precision machine tools. Japan didn't possess high-octane fuel. Japan couldn't produce aluminum alloys. Japan increasingly lacked advanced electronics. Japan had barely begun experimenting with, in contrast, American factories, massive plants in Wichita, Omaha, and Marietta, operated with assembly lines that resembled science fiction to Japanese eyes. Thousands of skilled workers, automated processes, and vast supplies of aluminum allowed the U.S. to manufacture B-29s in quantities Japan couldn't comprehend. One intelligence analyst, reviewing U.S. production numbers, whispered to his superior, "They build more aircraft in a month than we do in a year." His superior stared blankly at the report. Then, the war is already lost. The deeper Japanese engineers studied the B-29, the more impossible it seemed. Its pressurized cabin. Japan had never successfully designed one. Its remote-controlled fire control system. Japan had no equivalent computing technology. Its strengthened fuselage. Japan lacked the alloys to replicate it. Its enormous wings. Japan lacked factories large enough to assemble them. In truth, Japan wasn't even close. A classified engineering report submitted to the Imperial General Staff concluded, "This aircraft represents a level of industrial and technological development far beyond our current capacity." The bluntness of the statement was shocking. Engineers rarely spoke so directly to military leadership, but the truth could no longer be hidden. The Empire could not match the Even Japanese pilots who encountered the B-29 described it in almost mythical terms. One ace said, "It felt like attacking a steel whale in the sky." By early 1945, Japan attempted desperate solutions. They modified existing fighters. They experimented with air-to-air ramming tactics. Some engineers suggested suicide attacks as the only reliable method to damage a B-29. These ideas didn't come from fanaticism. They came from despair. The B-29 was the engineer's nightmare, the strategist's nightmare, the pilot's nightmare. It represented every weakness Japan had tried to hide since the first days of the war, and as factories burned and cities crumbled under firebombs, one truth became undeniable. Japan could not build a B-29. Japan could not stop the B-29. Japan could only endure it. When the B-29 Superfortress first appeared over Japan, the attacks were not yet the devastating firebombing raids that would later incinerate entire cities. These early missions had a different purpose: to test Japan's defenses, probe its weaknesses, and measure its response. But even these initial high-altitude raids, light by later standards, sent shockwaves through the Japanese government, military, and civilian population. On June 15, 1944, as the first formation of B-29s approached Japan, anti-aircraft batteries across Kyushu scrambled into action. Gun crews, drilled for years, swung their barrels skyward and fired volleys of shells that exploded thousands of feet below the American bombers. Soldiers watched in stunned disbelief. The B-29s simply continued forward, unshaken, gliding past the black bursts of flak like giants brushing off insects. A gunnery officer shouted, "Increase elevation." Another replied desperately, "We're already at maximum." No one had imagined a bomber could fly this high. In controlled bunkers, Japanese commanders monitored the situation with growing frustration. Radar tracked the B-29SA, but no weapon in Japan's inventory could reach their altitude. Even the Type 88 anti-aircraft gun, The pride of the home defense was ineffective. Its shells detonated too low. Its targeting system struggled with the bomber's speed. Its crews reported a heartbreaking reality. "We cannot hit them." A phrase that would become all too familiar in the months to come. Osaka, Nagoya, and northern Kyushu were among the first targets. The Americans focused on industrial sites, maritime facilities, and aircraft factories. The physical damage from these early raids was limited by weather and inexperience. But Japan wasn't measuring tons of bombs dropped. Japan was measuring the psychological impact. Civilians crowded streets, pointing to the sky in awe and terror. Children asked parents why the planes looked so small and silver, like falling stars refusing to fall. Elderly citizens, who remembered the biplanes of the 1920s, could not grasp how such monstrous machines could fly so high. In radio broadcasts that night, the Japanese government attempted to calm the public, calling the raids minor nuisances. But behind closed doors, panic rippled through every level of command. The Imperial Army Air Service conducted emergency meetings across Tokyo. Reports came in from fighter squadrons. Engines overheated before reaching interception. Altitude fuel consumption skyrocketed during the climb. Aircraft performance dropped sharply in the thin air. Pilots suffered oxygen loss and frostbite. Even when the most determined Zero and Ki-43 pilots managed to reach the rare heights where the B-29s flew, they arrived exhausted, barely able to maneuver. Their bullets, fired at extreme upward angles, lost velocity rapidly. Attacking a superfortress became an act of bravery, bordering on hopelessness. One pilot returned to base pale and shaken. He told his commander, "It felt like trying to stab the moon." Inside the Imperial General Staff, senior officers studied reconnaissance photos of the American bombers. What rattled them most was not the damage caused by the raids but the clarity of the implications. America was testing Japanese defenses brick by brick, and Japan was failing every test. One intelligence officer warned his superiors, "These raids are not the main attack. They are the beginning of something far worse." He was right. These initial high-altitude missions served as reconnaissance, calibration, and intimidation. The Americans learned how Japan responded, how radar tracked, how fighters scrambled, how defenses operated, and how weather affected bombing accuracy. Japan, meanwhile, learned a far more painful lesson. The B-29 was not a bomber Japan could fight. It was a bomber Japan could only fear. And this was just the beginning. By late 1944, Japan had endured waves of conventional bombings, but nothing could compare to what the Americans had devised with the B-29. As the Superfortresses began to arrive in increasing numbers from the Marianas, a terrifying new strategy emerged, a tactic that would rewrite the rules of warfare: firebombing. Unlike conventional explosives that destroyed buildings and infrastructure, firebombing targeted the very lifeblood of Japanese cities. The densely packed wooden homes, narrow streets, and urban centers that created a perfect tinderbox for American military planners knew that Japan's cities were vulnerable in a way that European cities were not. Whereas cities like London and Berlin had broad avenues and stone buildings, Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe were almost entirely wooden. Even a single incendiary bomb could ignite a conflagration that would spread uncontrollably. The new strategy combined precision bombing with overwhelming incendiary payloads. Each B-29 could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, a mixture of high explosives and incendiaries, designed to first damage rooftops and gas lines, then ignite fires across wide areas. The goal was not just to destroy infrastructure. It was to break the spirit of the Japanese people, to force them to confront the futility of resistance by demonstrating that nowhere was safe. On the night of November 24th, 1944, the Americans launched one of their first true firebombing raids against Tokyo. Observers on the ground reported a surreal scene, a red glow spreading across the horizon as thousands of fires erupted simultaneously. Eyewitnesses described streets turning into rivers of fire and plumes of smoke rising hundreds of feet into the sky, blocking out the stars. Military command in Tokyo initially struggled to comprehend the scale. Emergency response teams were overwhelmed. Fire brigadas, unprepared for the intensity and speed of the could only fight sporadically, often retreating as flames jumped from building to building. Civilians panicked, carrying children and whatever valuables they could salvage through chaotic, smoke-choked streets. The psychological impact was immediate. Where previous bombings had caused shock and fear, firebombing created terror on an unprecedented scale. Leaders realized that the Americans were not just targeting military installations. They were striking the very essence of civilian life. The Japanese government began to understand that their urban centers were now effectively battlefields. Japan's military scrambled to counter the threat. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned. Fighter squadrons scrambled, and air raid warning systems sounded continuously. Yet nothing could match the B-29's altitude and speed. The new tactic rendered existing defenses largely obsolete, highlighting a grim reality. Japan's home islands were no longer safe from devastation. Strategists in Tokyo faced an agonizing choice: evacuate urban populations or risk annihilation. Evacuations were slow and chaotic, and many civilians were trapped in the path of the next raid. By December 1944, firebombing raids had become a near-nightly threat, signaling a new phase of total war where civilian and military targets blurred. The psychological impact of the firebombing campaign cannot be overstated. For the first time, the Japanese public faced a tangible reality that the war was no longer a distant battle fought on foreign soil. It had come home. Families huddled in shelters, streets emptied, and the air filled with smoke and ash. News of destroyed neighborhoods traveled quickly, reinforcing a sense of inevitable defeat. Even among military leaders, fear and frustration grew. Reports of cities burning and the inability to counter the B-29s shook confidence. Strategists realized that unless a miracle occurred, the very infrastructure sustaining Japan's war effort and its civilian morale was under siege. The firebombing campaign marked a turning point. It was not just a new tactic. It was a symbol of unstoppable American technological and strategic superiority, signaling to Japan that the home islands were vulnerable in ways previously unimaginable. For the first time, the idea that Japan could withstand the American onslaught began to crumble. As the flames of American firebombing swept across Japan's major cities, a terrifying reality settled over the civilian population. There was no safe place left in the urban centers. The densely packed wooden neighborhoods that had once been the heart of Japanese life had become death traps. Families fled en masse, their desperation painting a stark picture of the human costs of strategic bombing. This was the beginning of the civilian exodus, a harrowing chapter in Japan's wartime experience. By early 1945, cities like Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe had suffered multiple devastating raids. Night after night, B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs with devastating precision, leaving entire districts in ashes. The psychological toll on civilians was immense. Families knew that staying in the city could mean death by fire or suffocation from smoke. Yet, leaving meant abandoning homes, livelihoods, and a way of life. Reports from the time depict a chaotic movement of people along narrow roads, often carrying only what they could salvage. Parents clutched children tightly, while the elderly struggled to keep pace. Trains and trucks, when available, became overcrowded lifelines. But for most, the exodus meant on-foot marches across the countryside, with uncertainty hanging over every mile. The Japanese government, alarmed by the scale of civilian flight, scrambled to organize evacuations. Schools, temples, and rural homes were repurposed to shelter refugees. Yet, the effort was piecemeal and insufficient, as the sheer number of evacuees far exceeded available facilities. Food shortages became acute, compounding the misery of those fleeing. Military authorities, aware that evacuation weakened the workforce supporting the war effort, tried to control the movement. They encouraged people to remain in industrial cities, even under threat of aerial attack. However, the fear of firebombs was overwhelming. Propaganda urging calm could not compete with the fear etched into every home and street. For many civilians, the exodus became a daily struggle for survival. Refugees faced exhaustion, disease, and exposure to harsh winter conditions. Families scavenged for food and water, moving under the cover of darkness to avoid potential air raids. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many suffered from malnutrition, illness, and trauma caused by witnessing the destruction of their homes. Despite the chaos, there were moments of human resilience. Communities formed makeshift shelters, shared resources, and provided care for the sick and wounded. Yet, Even these temporary reprieves were overshadowed by the omnipresent threat of B-29 raids, which could strike rural and urban areas alike. The exodus transformed Japan's civilian landscape. Cities emptied of families, leaving behind structures that would be reduced to ash within hours. People's sense of security eroded completely. The home, once a sanctuary, was now a potential death trap. Historian accounts emphasize a psychological devastation, constant fear, uncertainty, and grief over lost neighbors, friends, and relatives. For the Japanese government, the mass flight highlighted the vulnerability of the home islands. It underscored that the American air campaign was not merely a military strategy. It was a psychological weapon, undermining morale and forcing the population to confront the inevitability of defeat. The civilian exodus was a precursor to the total devastation that awaited Japan in the months ahead. B-29 civilians often traded immediate danger in the cities for hardship in the countryside, but there was no escape from the relentless march of war. The movement of millions of people became a visible testament to the success of the American bombing campaign. The fear, chaos, and suffering it inflicted would shape Japan's final months of the war. As the home islands emptied and cities smoldered, a stark truth became undeniable. Japan was on the defensive, and the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The civilian exodus was not just a flight from fire. It was the first tangible sign that Japan's ability to withstand the Allied assault was crumbling. By mid-1945, the B-29 Superfortress had established aerial supremacy over Japan, and the Imperial Japanese military faced a harrowing reality. Their conventional defenses were inadequate against the long-range bombers. The relentless daytime and nighttime raids had shattered industrial centers, decimated urban populations, and left the military scrambling to devise strategies to counter the invincible-looking American aircraft. Japanese air defenses were overstretched and underprepared. The Air Force, known as the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, had a limited number of aircraft capable of reaching the high-flying B-29s. Conventional fighters, such as the Mitsubishi K-67 and the Nakajima Ki-84, were initially outmatched by speed, altitude, and firepower. Anti-aircraft artillery, though numerous around industrial hubs, proved largely ineffective against formations of bombers flying at 30,000 feet. The military leadership, already battered by the losses in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, realized that traditional defensive measures would not be enough. In internal meetings, officers openly debated the need for radical tactics, recognizing that the survival of the home islands and the credibility of the armed forces depended on immediate, innovative solutions. Japan's desperation led to the accelerated development of experimental aircraft and kamikaze-style operations. Engineers worked frantically on rocket-assisted interceptors, including the Kika jet fighter, inspired by Germany, Messerschmitt, Me-262. These aircraft were intended to reach the altitudes of B-29s and disrupt bombing formations. Simultaneously, the military formalized the use of special attack units, precursor to the infamous kamikaze operations that would dominate the final months of the Pacific War. Pilots were trained to ram bombers if necessary, a tactic reflecting both the courage and desperation of Japanese forces. While morally and psychologically taxing, these measures underscored the military's awareness of the existential threat posed by the American air campaign. Implementing these measures, however, was easier said than done. Communication lines were strained. Units were scattered across multiple islands, and fuel shortages severely limited sorties. Commanders often clashed over priorities, with the Army and Navy debating whether to focus on defending major cities or key industrial targets. The B-29 raids, however, left little room for strategic planning. The attacks were relentless, and the clock was ticking. Japan's military also mobilized civilians to support anti-aircraft efforts. Thousands of men, women, and even children were enlisted to operate basic anti-aircraft guns and assist in air raid drills. These efforts, while courageous, were largely symbolic in the face of high-altitude B-29 formations. Nonetheless, the militarization of the civilian population highlighted the all-encompassing nature of the war effort, and Japan's increasing dependence on total war strategies. By late spring 1945, Japanese planners acknowledged a hard truth: technological inferiority. Logistical constraints and the overwhelming air power of the Allies made victory through conventional defense impossible. The focus shifted from trying to shoot down every bomber to mitigating damage and preserving morale, emphasizing evacuation, fire breaks, and emergency medical preparation. This phase marked a turning point in Japan's military approach. The era of confident expansion had ended. Now, survival dictated every decision. The B-29 raids were no longer just bombing runs. They were psychological weapons, forcing Japan to confront the inevitability of devastation on both the military and civilian fronts. The desperate measures undertaken by Japan in response to the B-29 threat revealed a nation pushed to the brink. The military's frantic innovations, suicide tactics, and mobilization of civilians reflected both courage and the harsh reality of a war. Japan was no longer winning. The high-flying bombers had not only destroyed infrastructure, they had shattered the illusion of invincibility and forced Japan to face the stark, unavoidable consequences of its strategic vulnerabilities. In the coming chapters, we will explore how these measures failed to halt the destruction and how the American bombing campaign evolved into a strategy that would ultimately bring Japan to the brink of surrender. The night of March 9th, 1945, would forever be etched into the memory of Japan. Tokyo, the sprawling capital, became the stage for one of the most devastating air raids in human history. Under the cover of darkness, 334 B-29 Superfortresses of the U.S. Army Air Forces launched Operation Meeting, a meticulously planned attack designed to cripple Japan's industrial capacity and break civilian morale. For those on the ground, the event was apocalyptic. Unlike previous raids that focused on military installations, Operation Meeting House targeted residential districts, factories, and transportation hubs, a shift in strategy that emphasized the destructive power of firebombing. Each B-29 carried tens of tons of incendiary bombs, designed to ignite the predominantly wooden structures of Tokyo. Uitino's neighborhoods that had existed for centuries were engulfed in flames. Eyewitnesses described the sky as a sea of fire, with buildings collapsing in waves of heat and smoke. Streets became rivers of molten debris. Entire blocks vanished in minutes. Survivors later recounted how the roar of explosions, the crackling of fire, and the screams of neighbors created a surreal, nightmarish soundscape. Civilians were utterly unprepared for the magnitude of the attack. Families fled homes in pajamas, clutching children and valuables, only to be trapped in streets that were burning or filled with panicked crowds. Firestorms generated hurricanes of heat and debris, making escape nearly impossible for many. Hospitals were overwhelmed. First responders were powerless against the rapidly spreading flames. Accounts from survivors reveal a harrowing picture. Parents carrying children through streets where embers fell like rain, neighbors attempting to rescue one another from burning homes, and people leaping into canals or rivers in a desperate bid for survival. Some describe the sky glowing red, reflecting off smoke and ash, giving the illusion that the city itself was ablaze from within. From the air, the operation was considered a tactical success. B-29 crews reported continuous explosions and fires spreading across Tokyo, with visibility blocked by dense smoke. The attack disrupted railways, paralysed communications, and destroyed factories crucial to Japan's war effort. Strategically, it demonstrated the B-29's ability to strike deep into the heart of the Japanese capital, at night, with precision and devastating effect. For Japanese military leaders, however, the raid was a horrifying confirmation of vulnerability. Anti-aircraft defenses had been largely ineffective. Fighter interceptors struggled to reach the bombers at high altitudes. Commanders realized that the American air campaign had escalated beyond their capacity to defend, forcing them to accept that urban centers were now battlefields. The psychological toll on civilians cannot be overstated. Survivors reported shock, despair, and disbelief at the scale of destruction. Many had believed air raids were limited to industrial or military targets, but the incendiary bombs proved that no one was safe. Children hid in basements or shelters, crying and screaming. Parents clung to their families, unable to protect them from the flames. The firestorm also had long-term effects: trauma, loss of community, and the collapse of essential services. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, leaving tens of thousands homeless overnight. For the Japanese leadership, it underscored the urgent need to reconsider defensive priorities, even as resources dwindled and morale sagged. The night Tokyo burned was a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. It demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of the B-29, the vulnerability of Japanese cities, and the human cost of strategic bombing. Eyewitness accounts provide an unflinching view of the horrors endured by civilians, while military reports confirm the raid's tactical success. Operation Meeting House marked the beginning of a relentless air campaign that would devastate Japan's urban centers and weaken its capacity to continue the war. It was a night of destruction, desperation, and unprecedented firepower, illustrating how the skies over Japan had become a theater of total war. In the wake of the firebombing of Tokyo and other major cities, Japan's military leadership scrambled to respond, but the reality was stark. The Imperial Army and Navy were stretched thin, depleted, and facing an enemy with overwhelming technological and logistical superiority. The B-29 raids had forced Japan into a defensive posture it had never fully prepared for, revealing the vulnerabilities in both strategy and morale. Japanese air defenses, already weakened by prolonged conflict and the attrition of experienced pilots, were ill-equipped to counter the high-flying B-29 Superfortresses. Anti-aircraft artillery was largely ineffective against bombers operating at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, and fighter interceptors struggled to climb in time to intercept them. In Tokyo alone, dozens of pilots were scrambled, but many missions ended in disastrous failure, with aircraft shot down before they could reach the bombers or returned with heavy losses. The Japanese Navy attempted to redeploy some fighter units from other theaters, but logistical constraints made rapid movement impossible. Fuel shortages, maintenance issues, and a shortage of trained pilots meant that even well-intentioned counterattacks were limited in scope and largely symbolic. Japan's leadership faced a profound dilemma: continue defending major cities at great cost or withdraw resources to protect industrial centers and military installations inland. Military planners debated reinforcing airfields, redistributing anti-aircraft batteries, and launching preemptive strikes against American air bases in the Marianas. However, these options were constrained by Japan's dwindling resources, overstretched supply lines, and the growing reach of American air power. One desperate measure involved the hurried formation of kamikaze-style tactics for defensive purposes, including suicide missions to intercept B-29SA, while morale boosting for some. These missions were unable to significantly impact the outcome. Japan's strategic options were narrowing, and every plan came with catastrophic risks and limited potential for success. The repeated raids shattered confidence among senior officers. High-ranking generals and admirals, accustomed to traditional battlefield engagements, were confronted with an enemy that struck without warning, bypassing conventional defenses. Reports of firestorms engulfing civilian populations caused internal debates about the effectiveness of continuing the war and the likelihood of ultimate defeat. Some commanders urged a reorganization of air defense strategies, including dispersal of industry and the construction of underground factories. Others argued for a final, all-out effort to repel American bombers at any cost. The tension between desperation and pragmatism created friction in military councils, reflecting the mounting pressure of an unwinnable situation. Amid the chaos, coordination between military authorities and local governments became crucial. Firefighting efforts, evacuation, planning, and civil defense initiatives were desperately mobilized, yet often lacked resources and manpower. Military personnel were deployed to protect key installations and maintain order, but the scale of destruction made these measures largely reactive. Communications were disrupted, and reports of destroyed neighborhoods reached Central Command slowly, complicating efforts to plan countermeasures. In many cases, military efforts were too little, too late, highlighting the widening gap between strategic intent and operational capability. Japan's military response to the B-29 raids was marked by courage, improvisation, and tragic futility. Despite the bravery of pilots and the ingenuity of defensive measures, the combination of technological superiority, logistical limitations, and overwhelming American air power rendered most efforts ineffective. The raids exposed the fragility of Japan's war infrastructure and foreshadowed the relentless devastation to come. The night Tokyo burned was not just a civilian catastrophe. It was a stark illustration of Japan's shrinking strategic options. As the war progressed, the imperial military faced an unrelenting campaign in which even the most heroic counterattacks could not halt the tide of destruction. It was a sobering reality. Japan was fighting a war increasingly defined by its inability to respond effectively. By mid-1945, the relentless American B-29 bombing campaign had left Japan's cities in ruins and its civilian population reeling. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and countless smaller towns were smoldering landscapes of destruction, with firestorms consuming neighborhoods and reducing entire districts to ashes. The psychological and physical toll on the population was staggering. Millions were displaced, tens of thousands dead, and countless more suffering from burns, starvation, and disease. Yet, in the halls of power, the imperial government remained reluctant to concede defeat, clinging to honor, tradition, and the ideology of national endurance. For ordinary Japanese citizens, life had become a nightmarish struggle for survival. Air raid sirens became a daily reality, signaling imminent death from above. Families huddled in makeshift shelters, often with insufficient food, water, or medical supplies. Children, elderly, and the infirm were especially vulnerable, and many perished despite desperate efforts to flee or hide. In cities like Tokyo, the aftermath of firebombing raids revealed entire neighborhoods flattened, leaving survivors wandering through rubble, searching for relatives, food, or any semblance of shelter. Psychological trauma was rampant. Many civilians began to lose faith in the war effort, questioning the wisdom of continued resistance as the promise of victory seemed increasingly impossible. The Japanese government attempted to maintain morale and order through propaganda, emphasizing patriotism and the duty to defend the homeland. Posters, radio broadcasts, and school programs encouraged civilians to contribute to the war effort, even as conditions worsened. Volunteer fire brigades and civil defense units were organized to combat the effects of bombings, but resources were scarce, and the scale of devastation often overwhelmed their efforts. Despite these attempts, the repeated destruction of major cities created a growing sense of inevitability among the populace. Reports of American bombings combined with news of defeats abroad in the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan in August 1945 made it increasingly clear that surrender was not just possible, but necessary to prevent total annihilation. The Imperial Japanese military, once a formidable force, was crippled by attrition, shortages, and the technological superiority of the Allies. Fighter units had been decimated, naval power was virtually non-existent, and army divisions lacked adequate supplies and equipment. Efforts to mount last-ditch counterattacks against B-29 raids or potential Allied invasions were largely symbolic, unable to stem the tide of devastation. Even senior military leaders recognized the futility of continued resistance. Discussions within the Supreme War Council grew tense, with factions divided between the insistence on fighting to the death and the pragmatic acceptance of surrender to save the population from further suffering. By late summer 1945, Japan faced a harrowing choice. The combination of aerial bombardment, naval blockades, and the looming Soviet threat forced the government to confront reality. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, coupled with the B-29's prior campaigns across the home islands, convinced Emperor Hirohito and his advisors that further resistance would be catastrophic. The civilian suffering, increasingly visible to the leadership, became a decisive factor. Millions of lives hung in the balance, and the stark contrast between national pride and the practical need to end the war could no longer be ignored. The decision to surrender was framed not only as a military necessity, but as a moral imperative, aimed at preserving the remnants of the population and averting complete collapse. The B-29 bombings, firestorms, and cumulative Allied pressure had brought Japan to the brink of surrender. Civilian desperation, military collapse, and strategic inevitability converged to force the imperial government's hand. The path to surrender was not instantaneous. It was the result of relentless pressure, immense human suffering, and the sobering realization that continued resistance would achieve nothing but more death and destruction. By the time Japan formally capitulated on August 15, 1945, the home islands had been irrevocably scarred. The war's end marked the conclusion of a chapter defined by desperation, courage, and the limits of human endurance. For the civilians, and military alike. The B-29 campaigns had underscored a stark truth. In modern warfare, technological might and strategic precision often decide the fate of nations, leaving those unprepared to face unimaginable consequences.